Isleño is the Spanish word meaning islander. The term was applied to the Canary Islanders to distinguish them from Spanish mainlanders known as peninsulars. The Isleños are the inhabitants of the Canary Islands, and by extension the descendants of Canarian settlers and emigrants to present-day Louisiana, Texas, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, and other parts of the Americas. In these places, the name, which formerly referred to a general category of people, now refers to the specific cultural identity of Canary Islanders of the descendants throughout Latin America and in Louisiana, where they are still called Isleños or Los Isleños. Another name for Canary Islander in English is Canarian. Quote, in Spanish, an alternative is Canario or Isleño Canario. The term Isleño is still used in Latin America, at least in those countries which had large Canarian populations, to distinguish a Canary Islander from a peninsulary. By the early 19th century there were more people of Canarian extraction in the Americas than in the Canary Islands themselves, and the number of descendants of those first immigrants is exponentially larger than the number who originally migrated. The Americas were the destination of most Canarian immigrants, for the discovery by Europeans in the 15th century until the 20th century, when substantial numbers went to the Spanish colonies via FNI, Western Sahara and Equatorial Guinea in Africa during the first half of the century. Beginning in the 1970s, they began to emigrate to other European countries, although emigration to the Americas did not end until the early 1980s. The cultures of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, and Uruguay partially have all been influenced by Canarian culture, as have the dialects of Spanish spoken in all but Uruguay, although almost all descendants of Canary Islanders who emigrated to the Americas from the 16th to the 20th century are incorporated socially and culturally within the larger populations. There remain a few communities that have preserved at least some of their ancestors' Canarian culture, as in Louisiana, San Antonio in Texas, Hatillo, Puerto Rico, San Carlos de Tenerife in the Dominican Republic, and San Borondón in Peru. General history. The Canary Islander emigration to the Americas began as early as 1492, with the first voyage of Columbus, and did not end until the early 1980s. The Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands had only recently occurred, when Columbus made a stopover in the Canary Islands for supplies in 1501. Also in 1501, Nicolas de Ovando left the Canary Islands with a group of people heading to the island of Hispaniola. In the early 16th century, some Guanches from the Canary Islands were exported as slaves to Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo, a practice that continued as late as 1534. In the first half of the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors, some of whom settled permanently in the Americas themselves, organized several groups of people chosen in the Canary Islands to colonize parts of Latin America including Mexico, Buenos Aires, Peru, New Granada and La Florida. There followed other groups who settled in Santo Domingo and Cuba in the second half of 16th century. In 1611, about 10 Canarian families were sent to Santiago del Prado, Cuba, and by the royal decree of May 6, 1663, 800 Canarian families were sent to settle in Santo Domingo. It is assumed this was to avert the danger that the French might seize it, since they already had occupied what is now Haiti. In 1678, the Spanish crown enacted the so-called Tributo de Sangre. This was a Spanish law stipulating that for every 1,000 tons of cargo shipped from Spanish America to Spain. 50 Canarian families would be sent to the Americas to populate regions having low populations of peninsulars, or Spanish-born Spaniards. Consequently, during the late 17th and 18th century, hundreds of Canarian families moved to Venezuela, Cuba, the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, with others going to places like Uruguay, Mexico, Argentina of the south of the present United States. These families were sent to populate various parts of Latin America. The tributo de sangre was finally abolished in 1764. Despite that, many Canarians continued to migrate to the Americas to escape grinding poverty at home. After the liberation of the Latin American countries from Spanish rule, Spain retained only Cuba and Puerto Rico as colonies in the Americas. It abolished slavery in those colonies, and encouraged Canarian emigration. Most Canarian immigrants then emigrated to the two islands in the Caribbean, where the labor was exploited and they were paid very little. There were, however, also thousands of Canarians who emigrated to other countries, including Venezuela, Uruguay and Argentina. After the annexation of Cuba and Puerto Rico to the United States and the prohibition of Canarian emigration to Puerto Rico in 1898, emigration was directed primarily to Cuba, with certain flows to other countries. After 1936, most Canarian immigrants went to Cuba and Venezuela until 1948, when in most of the islanders began emigrating to Venezuela. Since the 1970s, Canarian emigration has decreased, and from the early 1980s, with the improvement of the Canary Islands economy, Canarian emigration has diminished. Reasons for the Canarian emigration to the Americas. After a century and a half of growth, the economy of the Canary Islands was in crisis. The diminished output of Isleño Canario after the 1640 emancipation from Spanish rule of Portugal, whose colonies were its preferred market, put thousands of Canarians out of work, causing many of them to emigrate to the Americas with their families. There was discussion in governmental circles of the islands being overpopulated, and the Spanish crown decided to institute the El Tributo de Sangre, whereby, for each ton of cargo that of Spanish colony in the Americas sent to Spain, it would send 5 Canarian families to that colony. The number of families actually sent, however, usually exceeded 10. The occupation of Jamaica by the English and of the western half of Santo Domingo and the Guianas by the French made the Spanish crown consider this alternative in order to avoid the occupation of part of Venezuela and the Greater Antilles. Commerce in cochineal dye expanded in the Canary Islands during the 19th century well into the 1880s, when trade in this product plummeted, which, together with the coffee boom and the war crisis in Cuba, depressed their economy. This development also spurred Canarian emigration to the Americas. After 1893, Canarians continued to emigrate to Venezuela to escape Spanish military service. During the 10 Years' War in Cuba, Cuban separatists made a distinction between Canary Islander immigrants and those from Peninsular Spain, leading them to promote Canarian immigration to Cuba. The usual form of administration to manage this emigration from the islands prevail, with corruption and fraud governing the actions of the Canarian ruling classes. In the 20th century, poverty, the Spanish Civil War, and the actions of the Franco regime in Spain also drove Canarian emigration to the Americas. For the reasons already mentioned, there were specific problems on some islands that also boosted Canarian emigration. In Lanzarote, from the 16th to the 20th century, in addition to those general problems, the people experienced terrible drought, epidemics, house and tithe taxes, invasions of locusts, and several volcanic eruptions in 1730 affecting over half the population. causing many of them to migrate, pirate attacks and harsh weather conditions. Consequently, many people on Lanzarote migrated to other Canary Islands, including as well as to the Americas, including Uruguay, Argentina, Cuba, Venezuela and the southern United States.